The lesson for today is John 19, verses 1 to 22. Then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no crime in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no crime in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he's made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard these words, he was the more afraid. He entered the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Upon this Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king sets himself against Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, and in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, "Away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. And there they crucified him. And with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote a title and put it on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. The chief priests of the Jews then said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." We've known since the beginning of John chapter 1 that there would be a confrontation of the darkness and the light. And now we begin to see this confrontation in all its sheer horror, the torture and execution of Jesus. In Matthew 27, verse 30, Jesus foretells what will happen to him when he goes to Jerusalem. He will be mocked, scourged, and crucified. Also, it should be noticed that Mark and Matthew both say that the scourging took place after Jesus had been sentenced to death. Only John separates the scourging from the crucifixion. There were 3 sorts of floggings practiced in Rome: fustigatio, which was a beating with rods, flagellatio, which was a flogging with whips, and verberatio, which was a scourging. The first was given as a warning, the second for serious crimes, and the third started the death sentence. All were performed on a naked body, front and back, and all were regarded as shameful. The whips had bits of lead or bone weights at their ends, and sometimes metal. so little bits of flesh were pulled from the body when the whips were used. Often men being flogged could not control their bowels. Sometimes men died under the scourging. Since, according to John, sentence had not yet been passed on Jesus, it's likely that he received flagellatio. Yet if Mark and Matthew were right, it would have been verberatio, and it would have been shocking. No Roman Caesar was subject to that kind of thing. Even so, it's hardly in keeping with Roman law to scourge someone who has not been found guilty. John's Pilate is trying to appease the crowd who want blood. Also, perhaps he's trying to make Jesus confess under torture. The crown on which they put on Jesus is probably made of aganthus, a local thistle, and again wearing it is meant to shame the victim. All the details of humiliation, although they're horrific, especially in a culture which is given to shame, they're given with a pinch of irony by John. For him, Jesus is King of the Jews and more than the Jews. When Pilate brings Jesus out again to show to the people after he's been scourged and says, "Behold the man," he does this presumably to encourage leniency and mercy in the crowd once they see what a terrible state he's in. But it actually has the opposite effect. Pilate is exasperated. He knows full well that the Jews cannot crucify Jesus. Only Romans have the authority to crucify a prisoner. He's utterly exasperated with the Jewish authorities and the crowd for calling for blood, for apparently no reason. One certainly not. The court doesn't call for the death sentence. Then the Jews say, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he's made himself the Son of God." Now notice that this is a new charge against Jesus. Now, of course, Jesus has not made himself the Son of God. He is just what the Father has made him. The law invoked here is Leviticus chapter 24, verse 16. "He who blasphemes the name of the Lord shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him, the sojourner as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death." When Pilate hears the Jews saying that Jesus claims to be the Son of God, he becomes afraid. He hasn't shown any fear yet. The Greek is probably better translated as "he became fearful" instead. So he takes Jesus back into the praetorium and says to him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus doesn't answer. Perhaps Pilate begins to become afraid of Jesus being favoured by the gods. The Romans were highly superstitious. Of course, for us, in reading the story, we wonder where John the Evangelist gets the information from, since presumably he's not in the praetorium. Pilate gets impatient with Jesus and says, "You will not speak to me? You do not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" But we might well wonder who actually does have the power. Is it Pilate or the crowd? Pilate has the formal potestas of a governor, but it seems that the crowd has more power than Pilate. The crowd is forcing Pilate to do something against his will, against his better judgment. And Jesus says that he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Now this is not a reference to Judas, I think. He delivered Jesus to the Jewish authorities. But it's a reference to the Jewish authorities who take Jesus to Pilate, presumably Annas or more likely Caiaphas. When Pilate hears this, he tries to release him. But then the ground shifts. The people cry out, "If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend." And that makes the crime one of sedition. Pilate would not be Caesar's friend if he allowed another king to usurp his authority in Judea. Pilate relies on Caesar's patronage for his position there. Only now is Pilate made aware that this issue is not internal to the Jews, but rather it also involves Rome. And all the time we need to remember that Caesar enjoys the title Divi Filius, son of the god. So we're talking about whether you're faithful to the son of a god, Caesar, or the son of God, Jesus. Pilate sits down in the judgment seat. Gabbatha, it says in the scriptures. It may come from the word Gabbatha, which means ridge of the house, and would therefore indicate a raised pavement where the judgment took place. When all this happens, it's noon on the eve of the Passover, the time when the Passover lambs are slaughtered. John's point is unmistakable. Jesus is the true Passover lamb. And again, John's irony is apparent. Jesus is the king. The people cry out that they have no king but Caesar, and astonishingly forget that their true king is Yahweh. Pilate can do no more. He's undoubtedly worried that there'll be a rebellion, some kind of manifestation in the city, and he would have to use great force to put it down, and this would go against him, even though he was a severe ruler. He hands Jesus over to be crucified. Had Jesus been sentenced by Jewish law, he would have been stoned to death. Crucifixion is a Roman death penalty. And we might notice that no sentence of death is reported. Pilate simply lets the crowd have its way. This is mob rule. So they take Jesus out of Jerusalem to a place called the place of the skull, Golgotha. They can't execute within the cities because that's sacred ground. They must take him to a place outside sacred ground to execute him. Bandits and slaves, insurrectionists, prisoners of war were crucified by the Romans. No Roman citizen would be crucified. If one were to be crucified, one had to carry the crossbeam, the patibulum, to the stake, the stipes, where one would be crucified, and one would be crucified naked. So the images that we have that are very common in Christianity of Jesus carrying the entire cross to him, to his place of execution, is mistaken, and also that he has a loincloth on when he's being executed. That wouldn't have happened at all. He would have been stark naked. Sometimes the condemned man would be blinded before the ordeal. During crucifixion, men's penises would become engorged with blood, thereby increasing the element of shame. People would be mocked by the crowds watching the spectacle. Often criminals were left on a cross after they'd died, so they'd be eaten by carrion birds, wild dogs, and other animals. The rotting corpse was left as a warning to passers-by that Rome had authority and power. The word Golgotha is Aramaic for skull. Probably the hill where Jesus was executed looked like a skull in those days. It wouldn't now. Carrying the patibulum was regarded by the Romans as something that would defile one, so only the prisoner was to carry the wood. The crossbeam and the stake would be used time after time in executions, since wood was very rare in the Holy Land at that time. So when people have tried to find the true cross, the cross upon which Jesus was hung, they may find it, but it wouldn't be just the cross on which Jesus was hung. Many others would have died with the same pieces of wood. Crucifixion was, alas, extremely common, but there is very little archaeological evidence for crucifixion, even though we know it was a common form of execution. We have a foot bone of a man in his 20s who was crucified in the 1st century. It seems that a man in those days was nailed or tightly roped to the patibulum. Nails were usually put through the forearms, not to hold the body in place, it seems. And he was made to straddle the stake, and a long nail was driven into each foot around the ankle. It could take days for someone to die. And the executed man died from a mixture of loss of blood, hunger, and asphyxiation. Women, as well as men, were crucified, and there's an instance in the 3rd century of a husband and wife who lasted 10 days on their crosses. Pilate writes a titlos, an inscription, to be placed on the cross. This was a common practice, so that the passers-by could tell why the man was being executed in such a terrible manner. And there was usually someone who walked before the condemned man, crying out what his crimes were. What Pilate writes, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, is of course correct, even though it's written in order to sneer at the Jews. Jesus is the King of the Jews, and he's King of more than the Jews. So there's another Johannine irony in the narrative. The Jews don't like the fact that Pilate writes, the King of the Jews, but Pilate answers, what I have written, quod scripsi scripsi. And he continues to sneer at the Jews.